So today I'd like to talk about a topic which is rarely talked about in spirituality, but the one that I'm pretty sure a lot of you had some experience with. And this is depressions and migraines. Who here has any experience with struggling with depression? No? Good. Good for you. So approximately 70%. Who here has ever struggled with migraines or headaches? About 50%, maybe 40. And some people that didn't raise their hand to the first question raised their hand to the second one. See how common it is. The interesting thing is that there's actually a trifecta, I don't know if that would be the right word, of conditions. It has a name. It has a scientific name. I don't remember what it was. I researched it all in depth when I was struggling with my last depression a couple of years before my enlightenment. So I don't quite remember how it's called, but there is a scientific term, and it turns out that there are three conditions that are quite significantly correlated. And oftentimes people espouse them both, all of them, the three of them, which depression, migraines, and sinus issues. Interesting. So there's a very strong correlation. I've had all of them. So I struggled with depression. I spent about half my life in depression. I had tremendous migraines. I'll talk later about them. And I also had 4 sinus surgeries. Yep, 4. Very painful. And I still have some sinus issues. I still need to manage my inflamed sinuses by Flonase. It's getting better, but slowly. What's interesting is that depressions and migraines are cured, so to say, by the spiritual realization. It's not possible to be depressed if you're enlightened. And migraines have been slowly dissolving over the years, and I'll talk about this in detail later. And it seems like, it appears like the sinuses are getting better, but not as obviously as depression and migraines. Very obvious with depression and migraines, but it appears. So I think that it's not a coincidence that they are correlated. Even although, like, it's quite possible after 4 sinus surgeries that I'll be struggling with some sinus issues for the rest of my life. But still, a very interesting scientific observation. So let's talk about depression first. It's almost an epidemic, isn't it? So what is depression? And what does science tell us about depression? Interestingly, the science doesn't tell us much about depression. What is also very interesting is that those two conditions, depression and migraines, are almost entirely mysterious to science. They don't know what's causing them. They don't know how to treat them. There is no effective treatment for both depression and migraines or cluster headaches. None. Effective treatment. I mean, there are some things that bring some relief, but there is no effective treatment. And there is no good scientific theory about where they're coming from. I mean, some people, I wouldn't call them scientists, even though they call themselves that, would say something like, oh, depression is a lack of serotonin or something equally silly. Well, it's the same as asking, well, what was the cause of the incident? Well, the cause of the incident is that the telegraph pole turned out to be in the way of the car. Okay, well, thank you very much. You know, but what caused that? So why is there, even if there is a serotonin deficiency, which interestingly have never been proven. So the psychology is an extraordinary, let's say, undisciplined as a field of study compared to medicine, or compared to, let's say, physics, or any other more objective scientific inquiry. To the best of my knowledge, there have never been done any tests that would conclusively show that people who experience depression have statistically lowered levels of serotonin compared to people who aren't experienced it. It just has never been measured. No one has measured the levels of serotonin in the brain. It's a sort of a far-fetched inference from the fact that when we give people SSRI, which is, I think, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, something like that, then in some people, it tends to lower their level of depression. Not in all people. And so it's a very far-fetched conclusion that the serotonin is the cause. But even if it was correlated, the actual question is, well, why then, in the brain of this particular individual, we observe, if we observed it, I don't think we have, but if we had, why then we observe the lowered level of serotonin? And could it be a symptom of depression rather than the cause? So in science, oftentimes, they like to pretend that they know more than they do and give explanations which really aren't explanations at all. And there are some honest scientists that raise this issue. For example, there were publications that criticized the fact that we have never measured serotonin with scientific accuracy, that it's just an assumption. There was some research on modes of therapy. I remember I read it a long time ago, that basically showed that most therapies are as effective as placebo. I think the only exception was CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, which one of the methods of it is actually questioning the beliefs in the mind and paying attention to black and white thinking, catastrophizing, absolute statements like "I will never amount to anything," and challenge it logically. It's one of the modes of CBT, and I think that's exactly why it works. But it suggests that the most efficient cure for depression is actually time. So whether you speak to a therapist or don't speak to a therapist, it's as effective as placebo, and it tends to last the same. And the same, by the way, is true for a lot of people with SSRIs. So it's just they can get on SSRIs, then the depression runs its course over a year. It's not there anymore, but it doesn't mean that SSRIs were something that actually helped. In my experience, SSRIs is something that manages the symptoms of depression. It manages it by suppression. And that's why people on SSRIs, they tend to feel maybe not as so much in a very acute pain, but kind of numb. Kind of numb. When I was researching all of that, I ran across a wonderful man. I think his name is Robert Spolsky. He's I don't quite remember, he's a cognitive scientist or maybe an anthropologist, but he is a quite well-known scientist in those areas. And he, I don't remember where he teaches, Stanford, Harvard, I don't quite remember, but in some quite prestigious institution, if I remember correctly. And he has a series of lectures on depression. And he's a wonderfully intelligent man, a brilliant man, and he's one of the very few honest scientists that aren't afraid to admit that we don't know much about depression. So he analyzes the scientific evidence, and he comes to a conclusion that it's kind of a mystery to science. Not a mystery to me, not a mystery to any enlightened being about what causes depression. But it is a mystery from the perspective of science. There is no scientific evidence that could specifically point to a cause of depression. And so when I listened to his lectures, when I was trying to cope with my last biggest depression with some suicidal ideation and a lot of difficulty, it was kind of a blessing in disguise to hear that, because it meant that, well, shit, I'm on my own with this. Depression is a crisis of the argument with reality. It is always a crisis of identity. It is always a crisis of accepting a reality for what it is. And it's also a crisis of resistance. If you are depressed and you're bawling, crying, shaking in desperation, crying every day, you're not going to be very depressed for very long. What happens in depression, in every depression, as it starts to approach, as it starts to catch up with you, especially if you experienced with depression, you kind of know that it's coming, and you really, really don't want to go there. So you resist, and when you're in the midst of it, you try all you can do to avoid it, to distract yourself, to fix something in your life, to do something so that it goes away. The last thing that you want to do when you're in the midst of depression is to cry, or to be desperate, or to really feel the pain or what is going on. And that is also the turning point of every depression. The turning point of every depression is when you're no longer in denial that you're in depression, that you're very sad, that maybe you're desperate, that maybe you lost meaning, that maybe you feel like This life isn't worth living anymore. The turning point of every depression is the moment of honesty. And the more you allow this pain to surface during the depression, which is difficult, of course it is, the faster it will go away. Every depression comes from the past. Every depression is in some way a result of abuse and mistreatment. Every depression is a result of illusion that something that happened, and sometimes nothing happens. Sometimes on paper your life is perfect and depression still comes. That the circumstances of your life do not allow you to be happy. That you need something. Every depression is a cry for love. Every depression is a yearning for love. Every depression is a crisis of self-acceptance. So some people would say, you can be enlightened and be depressed. This is nonsense. I refute it. You can be sad. You can cry. But a depression as a prolonged period of numbness is a prolonged period of resistance of what's going to come, to what's going to come afterwards. And the sooner you allow it, the faster it will turn around. And we can see the same thing, not in the same intensity, but fundamentally very similar. Like, how do we heal from a heartbreak? We cry. Women know it better than men. After a difficult breakup, men usually want to tough it up, you know, not talk about it, pretend that it didn't happen. Women tend to talk to their friends and cry. As a rule, of course, every person is individual. There are just certain tendencies in how different genders are conditioned, but of course it's very individual. That's also why men commit suicide more after breakup. That's also why the latest scientific evidence suggests that men recover more, that it is more difficult for men and it takes longer for men to recover after breakup, actually. So they take it harder because they don't talk, they don't cry, they don't grieve. They want to appear strong. And they also have much less of a social network of friends with whom they can do that. For a lot of men, their partner, their romantic partner, is actually their closest friend, and oftentimes their only friend, and they don't discuss. You know, it's very rare for men to come together and start discussing what's wrong with their women. Women do that all the time. It's a form of therapy. It's a form of close relationships, which is outside of the romantic relationship. It's a close relationship with their friends. So it's a support network, which women tend to maintain and men tend to not. So if you are depressed, first of all, remember that it's not going to last forever. Feels like it. Not true. I don't try to deny it. Don't try to sweep it under the carpet. Don't try to pretend that it's not there. Don't try to pretend that your despair is not there. Don't try to pretend that your fear is not there. Don't try to pretend that your disillusionment is not there. We could also describe every depression as a crisis of disillusionment. There are some parallels between enlightenment and depression, because we could also describe enlightenment as the crisis of disillusionment, and very, very, very rarely people get enlightened without what has been called the dark night of the soul. It can happen before a realization or an opening, it can happen afterwards, but it almost always happens. And what it is just a very strong form of depression. So depression is the unconscious suffering and argument with reality coming up to the surface of consciousness. And the sooner you dive into it, the sooner you will emerge on the other side. Don't be afraid of it. For as long as it is still possible for the mind to be depressed, there will be a tendency towards depression. Even in enlightenment, this tendency does not disappear immediately. So there are a lot of people who, after a quite significant authentic realizations, still have periods of what can be considered to be depression. They're not as strong and they don't last as long. So whereas previously, for example, they could have a depression that lasts a year, in the state of non-dual awareness, they may have depressions that last, let's say, a month or 2 months, and they're not as intense. They actually maybe even be more intense on the level of how much pain is processed, but they're not as intense with regards to how thoroughly they're taken into this numb state of everything sucks and I don't want to do anything. So they're slightly more functional during this time. And then they slowly, as they process more and more of the unconscious suffering and they align deeper and deeper with reality, it becomes even less intense, so they're a little bit more functional. There could be a couple of weeks, ultimately you could be depressed for a day, let's say. But sooner or later, this goes away completely. There is a very big, profound difference between sadness or grief because something happened and depression. When you're in depression, you never actually know quite why you're in depression. Like even if something happened, like there's a breakup or you lost your job or someone died, there's still usually some understanding that it served as a trigger, but it's sort of taking too long. It's sort of strange that it's there. It's like it feels like it's just there as an existential crisis. When you simply process the events of your life, you grieve, and when you've done grieving, the grieving is done and you can live again. It's a much more natural state of consciousness. And then I want to talk about migraines. I've had a very significant and extensive experience with migraines. They started when I was about 15, maybe 14. And they lasted until my enlightenment. And they actually even continued into my enlightenment. And just like depressions, just like with depressions, as I described previously, they became shorter, less intense, less pain, and rarer, just like with depressions. My migraines were quite extreme, so they usually would last a day. I would be very sensitive to light. I would be very sensitive to sound. Some people see auras. There are like migraines with auras and migraines without auras, so some visual distortion, uh, which fundamentally I think has the same nature as the hallucinations and psychedelics and things like that. So people who have migraines with aura, they know that the migraine is coming because they see some visual distortions. The pain was excruciating, just completely out of this world. I wouldn't be able to move at all, or I would just be moving like this for hours. I would moan from time to time, and then I would start throwing up. Every time I would have a depression, I would start throwing up. I would empty my stomach completely, and then I would start throwing up with this stomach juice, which is just extraordinarily unpleasant. So there are just lots of spawns of vomiting, but there's no material in the stomach, so it's very painful for the stomach. Or even I would take a glass of water, and then I would throw it up. And then I don't even remember when was the last time that I threw up. I don't think that it maybe happened once or twice after Enlightenment, or maybe even not a single time. Even though migraines still happened, but this stopped happening, which is an indication of the diminishing intensity of the migraine. No one knows what they are. The only medication, the migraine abortive medication, sumatriptan, another medication like Zoloft, I think, or something, which I think chemically connected to sumatriptan, chemically related, doesn't work all the time, doesn't work on all people, does not reliably abort a migraine. And interestingly enough, I'm not a chemist. Actually know chemistry very poorly. I know physics quite well, more than most people that aren't in the field, and mathematics, obviously, because I'm a software engineer. But chemistry, I didn't like. I never liked it. But I think that I read somewhere that sumatriptan and LSD are somewhat chemically related. Don't quote me on this. Maybe I'm wrong, but like maybe like LSD is also from the family of triptans or something like this. I mean, anyone who knows chemistry would be able to correct it, confirm it, or deny it. But they're not entirely unrelated substances. Also, interestingly enough, when I took sumatriptan, and especially if it did do its job of either aborting or significantly diminishing the migraine, I would experience tingling, very strange sensations at the back of my head, just like I experienced later during the whole process of enlightenment, on psychedelics and meditation, all sorts of tingling and strange sensations at the back of my head and the top of my head and the front of my head. So I think that there is something there. I think that sumatriptan as an abortive only works to the extent that it is somehow connected to psychedelics, or work very similarly. I don't think anyone knows how exactly sumatriptan works. So I tried to, when I was researching some relief from migraines, I tried to look to the mechanism of action of sumatriptan. I don't think there's I don't think that there's a known mechanism of well explained mechanism of action of how exactly it aborts a migraine. So migraine is a neurological process. What is interesting about migraine is that, as most people know, some don't, but there is no nerve endings in the brain. So the brain is actually not capable of experiencing pain. Just like actually there are no nerve endings in the lungs. That's why people smoke. If there were nerve endings in the lungs, no one would ever smoke. It would be extraordinarily painful. Just look at the lungs of a chain smoker. It would be painful. So I don't know why there are no nerve endings in the lungs, and I don't know why there are no nerve endings in the brain. But actually, if you anesthetize a patient's skull and skin and all of that, and open the skull, and he could be, if you anesthetize it very well, he could be completely conscious. And you start tinkering with the brain, he's not going to feel anything. And actually, some experiments were done this way. So some kind of data that we have from electrically or physically tinkering with the brain and seeing what happens were done on patients who were completely conscious and aware. And of course, brain was not anesthetized, only this. So this suggests that the pain of a migraine is not actually the physical nature. And this matches my experience. That's why they go away. It is perceived pain. It's attention. I wouldn't take it so far as to apply it to all headaches. Obviously, if you had a concussion, obviously, if you have a headache because someone hit you, or there is something very wrong going on with the body, like maybe you poisoned, or you drank too much, like alcohol, or something like this, maybe it's quite possible to have a migraine or headache which isn't predominantly mental in nature. I wouldn't take it so far. It's still interesting what actually hurts in your head when you have a concussion, for example, or you have a headache after being hit in the face. What actually hurts? But with migraines, it was quite obvious in my experience what was hurting. I'm pretty sure that for the same reason, I don't think any studies were done on it. I would like it to see that. But in the psychedelic circles, it's actually well known that magic mushrooms are one of the most effective things for removing, dissolving a migraine or headache. So you see, Andrew is nodding his head. I don't know if he remembers, but on one of the music festivals that I went, and he was there, after the first day, I developed a very strong migraine, and his girlfriend at the time, Sarah, I asked her to get me some mushrooms. I couldn't even move, and she went and gave me some mushrooms and got me some mushrooms. Not a lot, actually. It was a very small dose, like a gram or a gram and a half, something like that. It wasn't even full dose. And I took it, and after about 2 hours, my migraine was gone. Usually my migraine lasts for a day. So there's some deep connection there. And then as I progressed on the path and my mind became clearer and clearer, and there was less and less pain, less and less unconscious conditioning, less and less pain from the past, less and less anger, less and less sadness, not through denial, but through accepting all of it and experiencing all of it and opening my heart and my mind to all of it. I have noticed that my migraines became rarer and rarer. They became less and less painful. And then ultimately, I mean, right now, it's even very difficult to say when I had a migraine the last time, if they're perceived as headaches, and very slight. Usually, if I just have a slight headache in the morning and I take a walk, it's gone. I can only say that I've had a migraine in retrospect if it lasts for the whole day or like 20 hours, and then it of course becomes unpleasant. But the level of pain, the level of actual physical pain that is perceived is absolutely incomparable to what it was before. Before, it was just completely debilitating. Now, if I ever have a migraine, I think that last time I had a migraine was quite a few months ago, like maybe 3 months ago or something, then it is unpleasant and it lasts more than just an hour. If it's a slight morning headache, it can last the whole day. But I'm not bawling or moaning or throwing up, and I don't perceive as much pain as before. So to me, it is quite obvious that migraines are mind tensions. What is also very interesting about migraines, which I want to share with you, is that if you look at this spiritual literature, you will see that a lot of sages and saints of the past struggled with headaches. They were probably what we would today call migraines. It's not hard to find. And many people on the spiritual path that never had headaches before, after awakening, develop headaches or migraines. Or their headaches and migraines can be exacerbated or last longer up to a certain point until also they slowly start to disappear. There are people who never had any migraines before, and after their awakening or shift into non-dual awareness, they begin to. And I'm also, like, based on my experience, I also have to agree with Osho when he laughed and said, no enlightened being can have headaches. It's ridiculous. If you have headaches or migraines, you're not enlightened. And he's right. They appear during the transformation, not when the transformation is complete. That's why my migraines are all but gone. And from my extensive experience with migraines and observing them going away all over the years, observing them going away on psychedelics, and also my claim and my experience that psychedelics, at least in kind of not extreme doses, but still doses that would be considered to be way over heroic, things like 15 tabs of LSD, the psychedelics do not affect the completely enlightened mind. It all points to the same direction. It all kind of forms a very coherent picture in my mind about depressions, about migraines, how they also treat migraines, how migraines are tensions, how migraines disappear, and how they fail to be effective, how psychedelics stopped affecting an enlightened mind. So you may develop on the spiritual path migraines after meditation, just in life. It's actually quite common. Migraines, in my experience with them and in my understanding of them, which is non-trivial, I think, from my personal experience, are mind tensions. So migraines is perceived pain. It's not actual physical pain, but it's perceived pain in the mind. And what you will also notice with the migraine is that as the migraine comes, there are usually a lot of thought of resistance, which is like, when is it gonna end? Why is this happening to me? Oh, this is so painful. Oh, why? More so than if you are in a physical pain that is unrelated. I mean, if you are basically in real physical pain, like let's say if you have, when something hurts in your body, right? So with migraines tend to be more mentally tortuous than physical pain. And in my experience also, weak painkillers like NSAIDs pretty much do nothing for a migraine. And even opioids like Vicodin, unless you get a lot, like let's say you get a shot and then you pass out, then of course you're probably going to wake up without a headache. But if you just take at least that was my experience, one pill or two of Vicodin, that doesn't take away migraine as much as it takes away physical pain. So there is something about migraine which is also mental anguish, and it is especially evident in the deeper stages of the unfolding, when the pain is not as overwhelming, so that you can actually look at what's going on in the mind. And usually during the migraine, what's going on in the mind is a lot of bemoaning, a lot of wishing for the migraine to stop as fast as possible. And what I even have noticed in the later stages, again, in the beginning, it's almost impossible to notice because the pain is so overwhelming that is the only thing that concerns you, basically. But when pain is less, when the presence is more, when awareness is stronger, it's also possible to notice that, like it was the case with my last migraine, is that after some periods of pain, for example, tears would come, and I would cry a little out of compassion for myself, and that would also mark the turning point of a migraine. So I would know that the moment I would cry out of self-pity and compassion because I have to go through such a painful experience, the moment I would cry, I would know that this was the peak of the pain. And then the migraine would slowly diminish over the course of the next couple of hours. In the beginning, when I was having migraines in the dream state, that wasn't the case. And that's not the case for most people. But deeper into the unfolding, I would also notice very strongly that every migraine would come with some form of emotional release. Which also, to me, is added evidence towards my interpretation of migraines as mind tensions. Another interesting fact about migraines is that there is an effect documented in the medical community, which is called post-migraine euphoria. And I have experienced it myself many times. Long before I read about it. And it's a very interesting phenomena. Like I would be having a migraine, and of course, migraine comes unexpectedly. So I used to work at Google, and then I wake up in the morning with a migraine and what it means. I'm absolutely dysfunctional, so I have to cancel all of my meetings for today. And at times I worked as a team leader or product manager, so I had quite a lot of meetings during the day. Sometimes very important meetings. You know, I could launch. Oh, sorry. I could miss. I could miss things as important as product launch meeting or something like that. And of course, I would feel very guilty about uh, turning people down. Sorry, letting people down. Have all sorts of uh, unpleasant thoughts about not being efficient at my job, or well, not probably as much as getting fired, but it's certainly not a very good impression when you're a product manager and you call in and you say, I have a migraine, all meetings today are canceled. So I would care about it, of course. It would be uh, hard. And what is interesting, what I've noticed in my own experience without before even reading about it, is the next day. What's interesting is what happens the next day. So I would go to bed. Usually by the time that I would go to bed, the migraine would still be there. And then I would wake up in the morning, and in the morning there would be no migraine. So 24 hours was my usual kind of cycle. And then in the morning, I wouldn't care at all about all the meetings that I missed. I wouldn't even have the inclination to go and check my email or write to all those people or ask how it was. I was just so happy. I was so carefree. Life felt so wonderful. So I always attributed it as just a reaction towards the ending of the pain. So basically, I spent in pain 24 hours, and now I'm without pain. So by contrast, of course, I would feel wonderful and great. But there was something more to it. I actually felt even better about life, and my mood was even better than my regular mood. So then I found that there's such a term as post-migraine euphoria. And when I look at migraines from the perspective of very deep tension, then a resolution of this tension, then it makes sense to me. Just like with psychedelics, just like with meditation, just like with everything on the spiritual path, it would make sense to me that the resolution, the relaxation of this tension would bring some sort of euphoric effect, more lightness about everything, less worry. It's as if the next day after the migraines, everything that I worried about just felt so insignificant in comparison to be able to wake up in the morning pain free. That's what I thought it was about. But I think there's more to that. It's something similar that we experience after meditation. It's something similar that we experience after psychedelic trips. So those things, migraines, depression, psychedelics, meditation, enlightenment, they're all very deeply connected. Another interesting thing that I've noticed about my migraines, and if you have migraines, I implore you to look at it, is what triggers it. So I've noticed that the things that triggered my migraines were the things that were bad for me, were where I was overextending myself in a way that wasn't healthy. For example, I knew my triggers very well because they were reliable. My reliable triggers were talking too much. Like, for example, if I spent the whole day in meetings, and I talked in most of these meetings, I spoke, quite likely I would have the migraine the next day. It would usually start developing by the evening. Physical overexertion. Like, for example, I used to play basketball, so if I didn't just play for 45 minutes, but I played for 3 or 4 hours until I couldn't play anymore, quite likely I would also develop migraines. Alcohol. So it got to the point where every time that I drank more than like 2 drinks, I would develop migraine. And so it became impossible for me to enjoy alcohol because I would start feeling worse due to the headache before I would start feeling better due to some possible disinhibitive qualities of alcohol. So since age 30 or something, I never drank more than like 2 or 3 drinks because I knew that if I did, I would have a migraine. So if you are very observant, you will notice that migraines are probably connected to what you do. Sometimes they don't. Like, I'm not saying that if I couldn't avoid migraines even by avoiding doing all these things, but they would certainly come less frequently and they would certainly be less painful. So I kind of, at some point of time, I started viewing migraines as an almost an emergency response of the body saying, that's it, you're doing too much, you're exerting too much effort, you're overworking, you're overstressed, you're pushing yourself too much, but you can't stop, so I'll make you stop by giving you this pain for a day, and you just won't be able to do anything but lie in your bed and rest. Of course, it is some rest, but the next day it is actually quite relaxing and euphoric. So in my view, migraines are very deep mind tensions as a result of living against yourself, as a result of overexerting yourself, as a result of constantly doing more than you want, doing more than you need. Don't have much to say about the sinus issues yet. I mean, I'm still having them, but I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, that's a speculation, of course, but I wouldn't be surprised if I had I gotten enlightened in like 20 or 25 or something like this, and went through this process much younger, maybe I wouldn't even have developed polyps and sinus issues, and maybe I wouldn't even need to do sinus surgery. I mean, now the point is kind of moot because I had so many surgeries that it's hard to say if it gets better with enlightenment or not. But I wouldn't be surprised if it does. So this just is this two things, depressions and migraines, are just an example of how deeply the conditioning in the mind, the pain in the mind, and then processed pain of traumas and mistreatments from the past, which is what the ego is, can affect the body, and it can affect the bodily experience.